Is Taylor, and this is the Wigger's diagram, which shows what happens during a complete cardiac cycle. So I'm going to be walking you through step by step and focusing on systole and diastole. So we are going to start with ventricular filling. So we are going to be right here. And we start in ventricular diastole, and when the ventricle is relaxed and filling, the mitral valve is open. So right here, the mitral valve is open, so the blood flows from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And because atrial pressure is higher, this orange line is slightly higher than ventricular pressure, the blood moves passively. So you can see that ventricular volume is increasing. So if we look at this line, it's slightly increasing as the ventricle fills. So next we're going to go to atrial systole. So we're just going to be right in this little curve right here, atrial systole. So we have a small bump in atrial pressure. The atrium contracts and pushes the last bit of blood into the ventricle, and this brings the ventricle to EDV, which is end diastolic volume, which represents how full the ventricle is right before contraction. So this is all right before contraction, right there. And now we're going to go into the isovolumetric contraction. So what we can see is a sharp right in ventricular pressure, this line right here. We also see a flat ventricular volume line, and the mitral valve closes. So now that the systole begins, we have that contraction. The ventricle contracts, pressure rises quickly, like this blue line right here. Teal line, and the mitral valve closes. Both valves are closed here, so the volume does not change, this last line, even though pressure is increasing. Next, we have the ventricular ejection. So we have the aortic valve that opens because once the ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure, which we saw right here, shot up, the aortic valve opens and blood is injected into the aorta. So ventricular volume decreases right here. The ventricular volume decreases. The amount of blood ejected is the stroke volume. This is the main pumping phase of the heart. So moving into isovolumetric relaxation, that is what is occurring. The aortic valve will be right here, closes. So after ejection, the ventricle begins to relax. The aortic valve closes right here, preventing blood from going backwards, and pressure drops right here. Oh, you can't see my finger. Pressure drops rapidly, but volume kind of stays the same. This remaining blood is called end systolic volume, which is ESV. So now we are moving on to the return of ventricular filling, and we have the mitral valve opens right here, and the ventricular pressure falling below. You see as this drops and drops below the orange line right here, which is falling below the atrial pressure. So once ventricular pressure falls below the atrial pressure, the mitral valve will then open, which is, like I said, where we are, and the ventricular begins to fill again. So this is the fill-in. So some key volume relationship is that this marks the start of the next cycle, right here, the cardiac cycle, and these volume changes down here are directly affected the cardiac output. So when the atrial pressure, if we look up here, the orange atrial pressure falls below, or sorry, higher than the ventricular pressure, the mitral valve opens, allowing the blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle during diastole. Alrighty, and when the ventricular pressure becomes greater than the aortic pressure, that's when the aortic valve opens, like I mentioned previously, allowing the blood to be injected into the circulation. So overall, the Wigger's diagram shows the pressure changes, how that drives valve movement. Valve movement controls the blood flow, and the blood flow determines changes in ventricular volume. So it kind of all works together in this complete cardiac cycle. And these kind of just explain how the heart fills, ejects blood, and maintains that cardiac output with each heartbeat. And this completes one full cardiac cycle. Thank you.